Welcome everyone to the Science of Being Seen with Kevin Williams. We're going to let the room fill up before we get started. So I would like to say hello and welcome to you, Jan, Lynn, Michelle, two Michelles, Nancy, Paige, Pat and Sylvia, Randy, Warren, Blair. It's so nice to see all of you in the room. It takes just a minute or so for Zoom to let everyone come on in. It's kind of like a small door with a big crowd. So we're going to let everyone come on in, and as soon as that is finished, we will get started. Cam, Christine, Dan, Jean, it's really nice to see you. Allie Riders, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but cool name. Lalita, Lauren, Lynn, good to see you in here again. I'm so glad that you all are with us. Deborah, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you here during the Rev conference. And it looks like we might have everyone in the room. So I am going to, without further ado, introduce our next Rev Pro. His name is Kevin Williams. Kevin is the owner of Survival Skills Rider Training. He is a serial writer, a scientific thinker, a rider coach, a safety advocate, and the creator of the Science of Being Seen. Now, I'm going to let him tell you the rest of that story. Thank you so much for being here, Kevin. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brittany. Right, hello. Hi, good to meet everybody virtually. I'm just going to set the screen share up so that you can see my presentation. Here we go. So, there we are. Let me just show you the very first slide. Now, hopefully this will play smoothly. I know they occasionally get a bit of hiccup with Zoom playing a video smoothly, so let's see what happens. Okay, now that you probably guessed was a British road safety video. That one actually came out in the mid-1970s. It was one of the very first that was made into a sort of video format. It was shown on the television, and it kicked off the Think Bike campaign that's been running over here in the UK ever since. You can date that for quite nicely from the car registration plates. It's around about 1975, 1976. And that little 125 Honda that you saw zip through the scene there is actually the same bike that I learned to ride on. So I'm afraid that gives you my date away, doesn't it really? But you get the idea of how long ago we were aware of this problem of drivers pulling out of side turnings or across the path of a motorcycle. How much has changed? Well, the answer is not very much. That photograph that you can see there, obviously two much more modern vehicles involved. That happened in London. It was a very high profile crash in the UK. It was the rider on the Blackbird that you can see there, the Honda, was actually a member of the police special escort group, and they are the police officers who escort dignitaries like the Queen visiting prime ministers and presidents and so on around the capital. So they're the most highly trained riders of the most highly trained riders, yet here is one of those riders getting caught out by a collision at a junction. So exactly the same crash that the average rider is quite likely to have. So that really is why I started to think about the Science of Being Seen presentation. a little bit about my background. Now, many years ago, I went off to college and came away with a science degree. I couldn't immediately get a job, so I actually went and got a master's degree as well. I still couldn't get a job, so to make ends meet for a few weeks, I thought I became a motorcycle courier in London. Well, that job actually ended up lasting 16 years, so it was quite a long time that I ended up as a part-time job there. By the time I'd done my 16 years of courier work, I was really a bit fed up with it. So I did the only thing I was capable of doing, which was learn to ride a motorcycle, but to teach people how to ride them at the same time. So I've been doing that since the mid-1990s. So I've got a fair experience as a rider coach as well. Now, when I was chatting to a firefighting buddy of mine, a chap called James Sanderson. He broached the idea of running a course that he called Biker Down. And the idea of Biker Down was that it would be mostly aimed at first aid and accident scene management. But what he wanted was a third module for this course, which would be how not to have an accident in the first place, because it's all very well teaching people how to deal with the consequences of a crash, but ideally we don't want people to crash at all. So Biker Down came about, and I first gave this presentation, Science of Being Seen, all the way back in 2012. So it's 8 years old, it's into its 9th year, in fact. Over that time, Biker Down has gone national right across the UK's fire services. Most of the fire services in the UK now run Biker Down. Most of those fire services deliver a version of my Science of Being Seen presentation. It's also been taken up by other organisations in the UK, including the MOD, for training military police, military riders, I should say, not military police, riders who own motorcycles in the Air Force and the Army, for example. In 2017, I got a phone call out of the blue from the New Zealand Transport Agency asking me if I'd go out there and give a safety talk to some riders in New Zealand. And I said, yeah, be very happy to do that, and didn't hear any more and thought nothing more of it until I got another phone call saying, well, are you coming or not? So I said, well, yes, I'm more than happy to. So I ended up flying out to New Zealand. My initial understanding, I thought it was just going to be one conference talk, but in fact it turned out to be what they call the Shiny Side Up Bike Fest, which is a 5-week-long tour of New Zealand, delivering safety messages to New Zealanders all up and down the country. A fantastic opportunity for us to deliver the message, but also for people to come and hear what we had to say. And we repeated that in 2019. So the nice thing is that Science of Being Seen has gone international, not just national. Now, it's important to understand actually what happens at junctions and how these collisions happen at intersections. And what you can see from the graph there are a number of different types. There are 3 main variants on this crash. In the top segment, the yellowy one, with 8% of crashes, those are crashes where the driver looked at the intersection but could not see the motorcycle. The bike was for some reason hidden from the driver. Maybe the bike was hidden by another vehicle. Maybe it was hidden by pedestrians at the side of the road. Maybe it was hidden by what we call roadside furniture, trees, or telephone kiosks, something like that. Or possibly the rider was lane splitting and was obscured in that way. But something like, sorry, that's the blue segment, 22%. I'm getting my segments mixed up. So something like 22%, which is just over 1 in 5, the driver looked and simply could not see the motorcycle. Now, look at the next section, which is the orange section, 35%. This is what we think of as the more conventional, sorry mate, I didn't see you crash, because it's what's known as looked but failed to see. So in this case, witnesses and accident reconstructions suggest that the driver could have seen the motorcycle, but for some reason didn't see the motorcycle. We'll come off to some reasons for that in a moment. But the bike was there to be seen, the driver just failed to pick it up. So that's just over 1/3 of these crashes. The grey segment, 35% again, so again, just over a third of all these crashes, there's yet another cause for these accidents. And this is looked, saw, and misjudged speed and distance. So in this case, the driver did spot the motorcycle, but for some reason made a decision to make an unsafe maneuver in front of the motorcycle. Now, the final segment, the small one at the top, 8%, the yellow one, which I misidentified a moment ago, the yellow one is the final section, and that is everything else, and that includes didn't look. Now, we as motorcyclists tend to assume that drivers don't look properly for motorcyclists, but in fact the evidence doesn't really support that. One of the things that's been going on in London recently is become a campaign to try to get drivers to put down mobile phones, because motorcyclists believe that a lot of drivers are distracted by mobile phones, and that's why they collide with motorcyclists. Firstly, if it was really true, we'd probably see more crashes than ever before at junctions, and we don't. So that's one reason that I don't believe this is actually true. And the second one is the police accident reports as well. There were just over 50 fatal accidents in London for the last year, for which I have figures, which was 2017. And precisely one of those was put down to a driver being on his mobile phone. Basically the same number of fatal collisions has happened when a driver had a medical emergency at the wheel. So the idea that we have that drivers simply don't look or don't look properly really doesn't hold up quite so well as we would think it does. So we have to look at some of these other reasons for explanation. Now, I said drivers looked but could not see. And what we're talking about here is what I sometimes call vision blockers, things that actually physically get between us and what we want to see. Well, it can work the other way. Drivers can be looking in our direction, but if there's something in the way, they won't see us. And one of the biggest problems is what's been termed beam blindness. And this is actually caused by the structure of the car itself. Now, if you look at the picture in the on the screen there, which I nicked from a car magazine, 1980, you can see how skinny the support for the windscreen actually is. It's sometimes called the A pillar because it's at the front of the car. By the second picture there, which is dated some years later, you'll see that it's grown considerably in size. Now, since that car was designed, it's got even bigger because the rollover tests, which are carried out on new vehicles, have got tougher. So the support for the windscreen has to become even stronger to form the safety cage around the driver. What else has happened? Well, airbags, of course, have gone into those supports, and you'll often find speakers as well for your hi-fi in there. So basically what's happened is that those supports have got really thick and chunky. Now, normally when I do this, I do it on a big screen in front of an audience in an auditorium, so it's going to be a little bit tricky, but I think you'll get the idea. If you look at the screen, you should see an X appear on it. Now, if you put your thumb about halfway between your eye and your screen, you should just about be able to cover up that X, particularly if you close one eye. Now, watch what happens. When did that motorcycle appear around your thumb? It would have been fairly late on. Now, when you're back outside and you're sitting in your car, just have a look at how thick those pillars actually are and work out how close a motorcycle can get to your car without you being able to see it. You'll be surprised how close it is. It's literally within 10 meters in many cases. And at that point, if you look then, you will not see a motorcycle, and that's when these Smithsy collisions are likely to occur. Okay, so moving on to the second series of problems, the failed to see when the bike was there to be seen. Now, have a look at the picture on the screen. That's a Tower Bridge, for those of you who've been to London. The motorcycle there is in nice clear focus, isn't it? That's because we're looking directly at it. But if you notice, the peripheral of the around the outside of the rider gets increasingly fuzzy. And that's actually how our eye works. We have a really clear zone of color focused vision right down the middle of our line of sight. But as we go outwards from that zone, everything out here is actually fuzzy. It's a bit like looking through frosted glass. We also increasingly lose color out into the peripheral vision. Most people think of peripheral vision as being out here somewhere. It's actually not. Peripheral vision starts here, about 5 degrees either side of the foveal zone of clear vision. So if you take your gaze off the motorcycle and you move it to the Mini, which is just to the side of the bike, which is fuzzy at the moment, and you imagine that the image, the image effect there was reversed, now it'd be the motorcycle that was out of focus and be fuzzy. So that's the effect of what's sometimes called peripheral blindness. Okay, gets more complicated. Bleep, bleep, bleep. Right, okay, what are we seeing happening there? Well, we've got a couple of effects going on. We have a problem that we just talked about. We have this clear color vision, which is right in the middle of our cone of vision. When this presenter's talking, where are we looking? We're looking at his face. That's what we're focused on. So our clear vision is focused on him. Everything else is in peripheral vision. So when that Spitfire first appears, we don't really see it because everything outside the guy's face is actually somewhat out of focus, even on the screen. But there's a second problem. That Spitfire comes straight out of the background at us. All it does is it gets bigger. Now, how do we spot things moving around us? Well, one of the things that attracts attention is lateral movement. There's no lateral movement there because the Spitfire is coming straight towards us. And the result is that that plane gets almost on top of us before we see it. Even when the camera shifts slightly to one side and tells us that there's something to look for, and we can hear that Merlin engine coming towards us, that plane is almost invisible against the background. And a Spitfire is an awful lot bigger than a motorcycle. So that's known as motion camouflage. Now, I knew about that from my science degree many years ago, but it took a long time before I realized it also applied to motorcycling. If motorcyclists come straight at a driver out of the background, they are motion camouflaged in exactly the same way as that Spitfire was. And it can even happen when we're moving laterally across somebody's line of sight. There's a problem that aviators and sailors know about called the constant bearing problem. If there are two objects that are moving towards each other on a collision course, the interesting thing is that the bearing between the two doesn't change. They just get closer together. So if you're approaching a intersection and there's another vehicle approaching the intersection from the side, and everything looks like you're going to line up at the same moment at the intersection, you don't just have to worry about that driver pulling out in front of you, you also have to worry that he hasn't seen you because of this constant bearing problem. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Okay, it gets more complicated. What do we do when we're sitting at a junction looking to emerge into a stream of traffic? Well, the common sense answer, of course, is that we look for vehicles. It's a common sense answer, but it turns out to be wrong because we learn very quickly as novice drivers, novice motorcyclists, as a strategy, it's not a very good one for actually emerging into a stream of traffic because all we see is the traffic. What we actually need to do is look for gaps. So what do we do as we start searching, trying to get out of junction? We find a gap in one direction, we start looking for a gap in the other direction, and we line the two up. And when they look like they're going to converge, that is likely to be our opportunity. How do we monitor those gaps? We turn our head. Now, I normally ask at this point if there are any ballet dancers in the audience, and the usual response to that is sort of no, oddly enough. But think what a ballet dancer or an ice dancer or anybody, and it dances and spins on the spot, what do they do with their eyes? They do something called spotting. They look to one particular point on the background, and as their body turns, they try and keep their head still for as long as possible, and then they turn their head even faster than their body, and then they refocus on that same point, that spot that they picked. Why do they do that? To maintain balance. Because we have two different balance systems that operate. We have the little semicircular canals in the ear that you'll probably remember from school biology, but we also use the visual system to maintain balance. If you've ever driven through a long tunnel, you may have found it disorientates you. Same if you come down a steep mountainside on a series of switchbacks with the horizon at a strange angle, it can be very disorienting indeed. And so it's that level horizon which keeps our balance. Now, one of the things that turns out to disrupt that is rapid blurring as the background moves across our eyes. So the brain does something very clever. It puts a shutter down in front of our eyes. So when we turn our head, we actually lose the visual flow. If you try it, you'll probably find that you blink as well as you turn your head. It's an involuntary response. Virtually everybody does it. So what happens is that when we turn our head quickly from side to side, we end up with a snapshot on one side, we end up with a snapshot on the other, but much of the information between the two goes missing because as we turn our head, our visual system shuts down. That's known as saccadic masking. What can we do about it? Well, we can turn our head a little bit slower, and then you get the effect you see on the screen of a series of saccades, these places where you can see something with the masked out areas. As the faster you turn your head, the bigger those black blinds get. The slower you turn your head, the more likely you are to spot something of interest within the visual field as you look. So that's a tip for car drivers really, but motorcyclists too. We all tend to make mistakes at junctions, bikers alike. So that's saccadic masking. But as I say, remember what we look for gaps. And even more complex is the problem of workload and inattentional blindness. Now, this is an interesting one because there's been some work done on this very, very recently, last summer, which talks about the very short-term memory that we have of processing what's literally coming in any 1 second. We look at a scene like this and the memory goes in, and almost as soon as we've seen it, it goes out the other side. Only some bits of that are stored and seen as relevant to what's going on. The trouble is, the more complex the scene in front of us, the more likely we are to lose those bits of information. New bits of information push the old bits that we've actually stored out. Now look at the scene in front of you, London again, and you'll see that there are lots of taxis, lots of cars, a few vans, just one bicycle over on the far right of the picture, and one motorcycle somewhere towards the center. And this is one of the problems of riding motorcycles. We tend to be massively outnumbered by other vehicles. So the danger is that not only does a driver look and then see us, but then forget again we were there because these other exciting things happen around him or her, but they don't even see us in the first place because motorcycles figure way down the food chain, as it were, of interest. We see what we expect to see. We see what we're used to seeing. We find it much more difficult to pick up objects that we're not used to spotting. And with motorcycles in the UK outnumbered something like 100 to 1 in traffic, there is a real issue in actually identifying motorcycles in a flow of traffic simply because they are so rare. Okay, what else do we know? Well, I talked about the third cause that drivers see and then for some reason misjudge speed and distance. I've picked a still from the video that we saw right at the beginning, because it makes the point that I wanted to make. The guy's fist there represents a car or a van. It's relatively broad, it's relatively low. It's a sort of fairly squat and wide object. By contrast, the motorcycle is tall and thin. Now, for some reason, nobody quite knows why, the human eye is much better at detecting changes of distance and detecting speed when something is growing that way than it is when something is growing that way. If you think about a car or a van, because it tends to be a bit wider than it is tall, it grows quite a lot that way as it gets closer to you. By contrast, a motorcycle, because it's narrow, even as it gets closer, it stays narrow, but it grows vertically. And the result is that if you put a van and a motorcycle side by side at the same distance, moving at the same speed towards an observer, and you ask the observer which one will arrive first, they will nearly always say the van. So they are anticipating that they have a bit more time before the motorcycle arrives. And that explains some of the faulty maneuvers where drivers look at the motorcycle and think, yes, I've got time to get out. And then, of course, they get halfway through the maneuver, realize that they haven't, and stamp on the brake. And at that point, the road is blocked in front of us. It's a fairly common crash scenario. So what can we do about that? Well, we can remember that it happens. And it tends to happen at higher speeds on faster roads. Not so much around urban areas, but out on the urban fringe, on the commuter roads, out on rural roads where everything's moving a little bit faster. So this is known as the size arrival effect. And again, it is a real problem that motorcyclists have to deal with. Now, what were we told to help ourselves to be identified? Well, one of the problems is we were told that if we wore bright clothing, wore white helmets, had lights on, like we can see in the picture there, we would be highly visible. Those two photographs are taken from the UK sort of road code document, which is called the Highway Code, from an issue about 20 odd years ago. So does it work? Well, have a look at the next picture. Any trouble seeing that motorcyclist and rider on his bike? The answer is no, because he is silhouetted against the background. So even though he's completely black in color, which we just were told is bad, in certain circumstances, black can be highly visible. So what we're looking at really is not the foreground color, it's the difference between foreground and background. And this shows up here, doesn't it? Because now you have 4 police officers, all with their high-vis clothing on, and they are beautifully camouflaged by the background, which is much the same color. So think about that when you're riding out in the fall, or even in the spring when you've got yellowy green foliage growing. We have this problem that's known as contrast camouflage, and sometimes what's thought to be high-vis clothing drops right into that category of actual contrast camouflage. Here's another problem. That's a high-vis animal. It's bright orange in bits, and we all know that orange is a high-vis color. It's often used by ASC rescue. But what do you also know about that tiger? As soon as it disappears into the undergrowth behind it, it's going to be hard to spot. And why is that? Well, it's what's known as disruptive camouflage. Those stripes break up the outline of the animal, and even though we see the orange, we can't make any sense of individual bits, and we don't see the tiger that's behind it. Now, the trouble is that some of the color schemes that we've been told were good to be seen fall into the same trap. Even the UK police tripped up on this one. Those are some police motorcycles. Most of the police forces have stopped using that particular color scheme. It's called Battenberg, after the cake, because what they found was it in fact broke up the outline of the motorcycle, and rather than making it easier to see, made it harder to see. Some Battenberg is still used, but very often in much bigger blocks, and very often the end of a car, for example, is solid color. And the police guidance now for motorcycles in the UK is to be all solid yellow. Now think about our own clothing and our own motorcycles. They're often multicolored. Have a look at the picture here. The gentleman having his holiday snap taken in the mountains. Notice how beautifully his BMW blends in with the background. Lots of greys and silvers and almost whites and almost blacks really match the the rocky outcrop quite nicely, and all you're left with is a couple of stripes of yellow and a few blobs of reddish pink, none of which will help a driver identify that motorcycle in any hurry if he happens to be looking that way at that time. So that's disruptive camouflage for you. What about day riding lights? Because that was another conclusion that has been come to in safety research for a long time, that day riding lights would actually help motorcycles be seen. Well, the evidence isn't there. Where they have been mandated, there's relatively little impact on collisions at junctions. Anything between 0 and maybe a 10% change in the number of crashes. Well, better nothing, but not infallible. And why is this? Well, one reason is that on a bright sunny day, with a background behind you there of a sort of bright sky, the headlight really isn't actually that bright, is it? And why is that? Well, that's because the low beam is actually designed not to dazzle drivers. It's designed not to shine light in an oncoming driver's eyes. It's designed to go below his line of sight. And what that means is the light that does come out of that headlight is actually simply the scatter from the lens, the badly focused light, if you like. And the better the headlight is, the less scatter there is. Now, if you've got LED lights on a modern bike, you'll have found that they're actually really quite bright. And so the designers have had to work really hard to stop them blinding oncoming drivers. So they have a really sharp cutoff, which you can see at night. As day riding lights, these low beam headlights are remarkably ineffective. So that's the problem there. Headlight is not designed as a day riding light. What about reflective clothing at night? Well, there you can see the problem. If you look at the rider from the head down, you'll notice that me actually on the bike, I'm wearing what's called a traffic vest over here in the UK, and it's got an H pattern of reflective material up around the torso and up over the shoulders. The problem is, you'll notice, is none of the light from the motorcycle behind me is actually falling onto that jacket. The big panels, which are reflective, are on the back of my legs. That's actually my US-made Aero Stitch Roadcrafter. So Roadcrafter, Aero Stitch, they've got the reflective material in exactly the right place. That is where you need it in an urban environment, because the light doesn't fall high up onto these reflective vests that many people use. And again, if you look on the left of the rider, you'll see there's a side turning, an intersection, and that's where we've been warned about the problems of people pulling out in front of us. Ask yourself where the headlights from that vehicle be pointing. They'd be pointing directly across the road in front of the motorcycle. Very little of that light would be falling on that motorcycle in any case. If there's a car coming the other way, which might be about to turn across the rider's path into that side turning, then again, the light is falling low down below the rider's reflective clothing. So we have a problem with the way that clothing is designed to be reflective. Put it all together. There's one of our motorcycle policemen on a highly conspicuous motorcycle, covered in lights, wearing light clothing with reflective material on. And look how the picture is split into two halves. The rear half of the motorcycle is actually surprisingly visible because he's outlined against a dark sky, but the front half of the bike has become almost invisible because he has moved in front of a light-rich background. And this is the real problem that we have with motorcycle conspicuity. It changes literally on a meter by meter basis. Whatever is behind us at any particular moment determines how easy we are to see. So what strategies can we use to help be seen? Well, one is to try to be a solid colour. That's a London paramedic on one of the pan-European Hondas, and you'll see that his jacket is matched to the colours of the bike, and you'll see that in front of a black cab he's brightly coloured. Look in the rest of the picture and you'll see there is a van over the top of the taxi cab on the left of the picture, and that's a drain cleaning company that's their coloured scheme. If you look behind the cab on the right, you'll see some people wearing pinky red coats and there's a couple of pinky red umbrellas, and pink will be quite important in the moment. But again, see how that same color scheme doesn't work in a slightly different environment. And what we actually need to look at to see whether our high vis or ordinary riding kit is going to be visible is what's called the color wheel. If you have a look at the color wheel, and you can see where the yellow color on that wheel is roughly, and you can see where the slightly yellowy orangey color of the background material is on that color wheel, and what you can see is they're right next to each other. If you want to be visible against that background, what you actually have to do is go to the opposite side of the color wheel. And the bad news, gentlemen, is that the best contrasting color for that full environment that you can see there is that sort of cerise pink, what the New Zealanders call man salmon. You'll see that if for a bright, sort of green, a yellowy, greeny, typically foliage for the summer, that orange actually makes a reasonable contrast over here. But for a rural environment, yellowy colors aren't fantastic. So that's something to think about. But black can be high vis. That's a RAF Hawk trainer, and you'll notice that the black body of the plane is very visible against the yellowy grass color. The vertical stabilizer is also highly visible against the eggshell blue of the sky. If you look over to the right hand side of the picture and just over the nose of the plane, you'll spot two ground crew in their high vis yellow who are beautifully disguised against the grass. So try to put a shape together, but remember, whilst black might be great at this moment, when the sun's setting, in a few minutes time, it will be dark and that color won't be nearly so useful. You can go the whole hog. This is an English actor. You may have heard of him, Danny John Jules. He's the cat in Red Dwarf, if anybody knows that, or he's also the actor in Death in Paradise. But he is rather fond of pink. I gave this presentation to Honda in the UK. He was a guest at the presentation, and he was so impressed he sent me a picture of him in pink. With lights, try again, think about where your lights may be working. Here, you can see the headlight is actually effective because the rider is silhouetted behind it against the bright lights of the brightly lit tarmac. But a moment earlier, that bike would have been well lit and that headlight wouldn't have been effective at all. One thing we can do in the UK is we can change our headlamp color. We can use yellow headlamps, and there is very recent research which suggests that using a yellow headlight actually helps drivers distinguish motorcycles within an urban environment. We can also use things like LEDs, but we have to be careful with these because if we overdo it, we just turn ourselves into an unknown object. What's the average driver seeing here? It's probably something out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They won't be thinking motorcycle at that point. Something that many riders have adopted in Europe is what's called the triangle of lights. They mount a couple of additional lights below or maybe even above the headlight to produce a triangle. And there is some evidence that out on rural roads, faster roads where motorcycles are traveling quicker, the fact that that triangle kind of expands gives drivers a better speed reference than the single headlight on its own approaching them. But don't think that it will help you be seen in town. The evidence is, again, there's negative there. Generally speaking, the point at which the driver makes a mistake in an urban environment, you're so close that the lights don't seem to make a great deal of difference. At night, well, we can use something called nicknamed ghost jacket. This is an example. The whole jacket is reflective. Many cyclists have started to use these on damp winter nights in London, and they pick up scattered light from all sorts of sources. So they don't necessarily reflect very strongly like you can see in the picture there, but they kind of glow, hence the ghost name. But know your accident. This one is the forgotten crash. Let me just pause that there. If you're watching in the US, we'll be on the other side of the road from you, but basically the crash is exactly the same. It's the oncoming car that turns across our path. many riders forget or never even knew about this crash. It happens, it almost comes out of the blue for most riders, as it did in this video clip, and it kills a lot of people even at fairly low speed in urban areas, because the rider has relatively little chance to see it coming and react. So don't forget, danger comes from both sides of the road. Right, so everything I've talked about at the moment, about high vis and reflective clothing and day riding lights, is all a passive defense. So it all relies on the other person seeing you. So be proactive. Again, you'll have to reverse this on your side of the road if you're watching in the US. But this line here that I'm going to take you through quickly is Malcolm Palmer's Z line. Malcolm was an instructor for many years in the UK. He's a good mate of mine. And what he realized was that to defeat this motion camouflage problem, we need this lateral movement. And this is what this scheme has. If we start there, somewhere out towards the center line of the road, that's generally where most riders will ride, approaching an intersection where there's a car waiting to emerge. So the red car there, we've got plenty of distance away from it. The trouble is, if we happen to be behind another vehicle, we now have a line of sight where we can probably see over the top of that car, but the driver looking at us won't see us because we are out of sight. But if we move a bit to the near side, we now open up a line of sight and the driver can see the whole of our bike and our body. We then reinstate our distance away from the vehicle to get some kind of distance away from it, so we're not riding right across its nose, and we're ready to perform an emergency stop or some evasive maneuver if we absolutely have to. But never ever forget that particular collision. Okay, and don't forget, we're all human and human beings make mistakes. This was clipped out of the earlier video. How many of you spotted that second motorcycle go through the screen there? Even though the rider is wearing a bright yellow helmet and a white shirt, I've watched this hundreds of times and I had never seen that particular rider, because I knew that the rider I was looking for in the video was the one coming across the screen from my right. So that rider came right through my line of sight and I never saw it. And the vast majority of people who watch that video never see that bike either. Now, we're motorcyclists. If we can miss a motorcycle like that, how easy is it for a driver to make the same mistake? Now, I've run on a little bit, but if you want to find out more about what I've been talking about, find the Science of Being Seen online. Should be fairly easy these days. scienceofbeingseen.wordpress.com is a website with all the research that I've done, and you can find out more on my Facebook page, which is Survival Skills, and you can come and visit my website too. Right, okay, there we are. That's the end of the presentation. So,
hello, I'm back.
You're back, yes,
Yes.
There we are.
Great,
Okay.
Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us. We have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience, so I'm just going to jump right into it if that's okay with you.
That's fine, go ahead.
The first question is from my fellow instructor, Ellen. She's an instructor here in the United States. She wants to know, when you described that our peripheral vision was blurry on the outer edges, could you also describe that as saying that it's more motion sensitive as opposed to focus sensitive?
Absolutely. What we see in our peripheral vision are two things: light and dark contrast, and particularly sudden bright lights, which is where the idea for day riding lights and also emergency services flashing lights comes from. But we also see motion pretty effectively in our peripheral vision. But what we're not good at is picking up things that aren't moving across the background. We're not very good at shape detecting in the peripheral vision. We have to turn our foveal gaze onto something to identify it, which is one of the reasons I have a little bit of problem with the idea that you can develop this kind of widescreen vision that Keith Code talks about. We really do need to move our eyes back and forth and hunt around the scene rather than just hope that things come into our attention.
Thank you for describing it that way. It's definitely, easy to not understand in one aspect, but when you describe it in that way, it might help other people understand. I know I've heard you speak so many times, and every time I listen to your presentation, I pick up something new. So it's really great to have you on here. I have a question from Dan Pedersen. He wants to know, and this is a little bit more of a political question for you. So zing, just for you, Kevin. How do we get decision makers to recognize that motorist awareness countermeasures like look twice, save a life, or think bike that everyone implements over and over just don't work, and that it's long past time to look to new interventions?
It's a very good question, and it's one I've been asked on a number of occasions. I think the answer is that motorcyclists, to some extent, have the power within themselves to change things. We have the big advantage over the sort of previous generations that we have the internet. We can actually go out there and research things. We can see what's being used in other countries, and there are places where new ideas are being taken on board. You know, I talked about the fact that I was taken out to New Zealand by the New Zealand Transport Agency, specifically to bring this message to their riders out there. So they have already listened, and they are already looking in at alternative approaches to the traditional look for bikes and bikers ride bright, which has long been the the supposed solutions to this problem. So I think the answer lies in our hands. If we can, through the various rider organizations, get this information into the public domain, eventually everybody suddenly thinks, oh yeah, I knew that already. And at that point, you know, we won't get any credit, but suddenly the next generation of riders will benefit from that sudden change of heart. We're starting to see that already in some ways. For many years in the UK, authorities were convinced that it was riders crashing in urban areas, being killed by drivers at junctions in exactly the manner I talked about, which was the big problem that they had to focus on. Then somebody actually went and read the statistics for crashes, and they realized that a lot of fatal crashes involving motorcycles happen out on rural roads and are motorcycle error, not anything to do with a third party. And so there's been a distinct change in the way that the focus has been on improving rider skills to actually improving rider awareness out of town. And that has come about largely, I think, because riders began to figure that out for themselves 20 odd years ago when they could first see stats on the internet.
So it's up to us. The power is in our hands. I like that answer. Power to the people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the differences like this, which reach motorcyclists with motorcyclist-based information, are enormously powerful.
Awesome answer, Kevin. Thank you. I have a quick question. Another one from as many times as I've seen your presentation. I personally, I don't think I've ever asked you this question. You talked about the Z line earlier. Here in the United States, we call it the Z line. Does the Z line have to do more with movement from side to side, or simply placing yourself in a position where the driver can see you because you're not hiding behind the car?
I think
a little bit of both.
I think it's several things. The first thing it does is it pre-primes our own brain to be ready to take some evasive action. The very fact that we've seen the situation and we are thinking this could all go horribly wrong, let's do something about it, let's try and take control of the situation, means that if it does go horribly wrong, we've got a fighting chance of actually pulling off the right maneuver to get out of trouble. The second thing it does is that it puts the bike in a position where the driver can see bike and rider, rather than having to rely on bits and pieces of information. If you think about looking over the roof of a car, what can you see of the bike coming the other way? Basically a helmet, and that's it. So you get the whole of the bike into play. You also then bring in, if you are wearing high-vis clothing and you're using your day riding lights, they are in a place where they can be seen. We then make that lateral movement, which may draw the driver's attention in his peripheral vision whilst he's looking at the gap, which may just be behind us, which is when we're at risk. And finally, by moving back away, we reinstate what we call here a safety bubble away from the car, so that the car basically has to go further to get us, which gives us a better chance of being clear of the collision zone before the car can actually get into our path.
Awesome. So a multifaceted strategy then would be a great way to say that that's what the Z line represents. We have time for one more question, and I think it's an important one. Amy wants to know how she can buy your book.
Ah, right. It's not on Amazon. That's the quick answer to that. It's on a publisher called Lulu. I haven't yet got round to getting it all hunky-dory on the inside. You have to get so many things absolutely right to get it published on Amazon. For the moment, I've just left it, but you'll find it on my publisher, which is lulu.com. If you find the Science of Being Seen website, you'll find links to it on there.
All right. Thank you for that, Kevin. We have a couple of questions that we didn't get to. For those of you who have questions that weren't answered, Deborah and Ellen specifically, Kevin will be able to follow up with you via email after this. So keep an eye out in your inbox and check for spam. Kevin will be able to answer your questions more specifically because you have great questions. And I apologize that we didn't get to them.
Yeah, sorry, I overran.
You're fine. Better to get all the information out and then be able to follow up with questions afterwards. So we will now do a 10-minute break, but first I would like to say thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing your knowledge. Your 30 years of experience in the science that you have compiled is just incredible for us riders, and I think it's something that everybody needs to listen to at least once in their lives, if not twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times like me. So very much appreciated. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody for listening. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, we're going to now take a 9-minute break. We will see you at the next presentation. Wendy Crockett talking about her 2019 Iron Butt Rally win. See you all in just a few minutes.